You are live. Yes, you are live.
Excellent. Yes,
All right.
I had to lose my virtual backdrop because my hat just vanished in the virtual backdrop. So
well, we couldn't have that. Let's do this officially, Liz. We need a big round of applause for you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
All right. So thanks for getting into the spirit and bringing a hat along, Liz. Before we kick it off, I just wanted to say one more thing, which is there's a lot of people online watching. If you're enjoying the experience and you want to tweet about it, the hashtag is Software Circus Fest. And without any further ado, I'll hand you over to our first keynote for our first ever virtual Software Circus, Liz Rice.
Thank you so much, Mark. And hi, everyone. It's so exciting to be, the first speaker on today's really exciting schedule. There are so many amazing speakers, and yeah, it's fantastic to be here. I love the fact that we have a theme. I tried to get into the theme here, and I've written my talk to kind of match the theme as well. So I work for Aqua Security. We are here, we do have a tea room. And one of the things that you'll be able to do at the tea room is you'll be able to download an electronic copy of my new book. So I hope you'll indulge me today. I'm going to basically compare my book and Alice in Wonderland. You might think that's a bit crazy, and obviously, Lewis Carroll was much wittier than me and had much more interesting characterizations than my book. But it turns out there's actually more similarities than you might think. For a start, both the books have an animal on the cover, which is, I think kind of cool. So as I say, you can get hold of a free copy of this book today from our tea room. So just for the price of your contact details, you'll be able to see everything that I'm talking about in this talk this morning. All right. So why isn't my keyboard working? Somehow I will switch to the next slide. There we go. Right. So when Alice is talking to the Duchess, she explains something in a really very confusing way. And Alice says, I think I should understand that better if I had written it down. And that really resonates with me. I think any of you who might have written any kind of content, created anything, recorded a YouTube video, written a blog post, the act of explaining something really ensures that you understand it yourself. And that's something I really like about creating content. So writing a book was a real opportunity for me to get into the nooks and crannies of some technical details that I wouldn't necessarily have time to cover in a talk. And maybe some of those details might be a bit niche, but I'd find them fascinating. I think sometimes those niche details are the most interesting part. And I really believe that curiosity is a very important skill for anyone who works in technology, particularly important for people who work in security, whether you're on the attack side or defense side of security. If you understand how something works, you're in a better position to understand how it might break. And that's really what security is all about. How can you break something in a way that lets you do something that the owner of that thing didn't intend for you to be able to do? Or on the defense side, what might people do to break into your system, and how can you prevent that from happening? Or how can you reduce the effects of an attack? One of the reasons why I wrote the book was because I really want to give people the understanding of the technology underneath containers. What's happening when you're running a container? If you understand how something works, you're in a better position to think about it. And from a security perspective, you're in a better position to understand the possible attack routes into your system. So, like Alice, let's all be curious. It will be good for our careers, I promise. Alice's curiosity takes her on adventures. And the same can be true for us. Every time we learn something, it can be an adventure, it can be really rewarding. Now, Alice's experiences change her sometimes physically. Uh, at times, her journey can be pretty confusing, sometimes frustrating, maybe even a little bit scary. Hopefully, for our journeys, we're unlikely to get threatened with having our heads cut off. I hope. Working in technology, we do get to learn new things all the time because the landscape is constantly changing. And I think sometimes it's hard to acknowledge how much we've actually learned, how much we've grown. I've certainly looked at code, wondered what on earth the person was thinking when they wrote it, and then realized it was actually me, a few months ago. I think that experience probably happens to a lot of us. It's okay. The important thing is to appreciate how much you've improved and learned since the time when you were an idiot back then. No, you weren't an idiot. You have learned a lot, and appreciate what you've learned and how you've improved. Now, I think in technology, we do have a bit of a tendency to use jargon, and this is really true in security in particular. There'll be a lot of acronyms, maybe people using terms without always entirely understanding what it is that they're saying. I do think that if you can describe something with simple words, you should do it. I think this is a really great lesson here from well, it was actually the eaglet, one of Alice's friends. There is enough complexity in the world. There is certainly enough complexity in cloud native without adding to it by using complicated language. So the eaglet in Alice in Wonderland, the eaglet calls the dodo to account for using these complicated words. And actually, the dodo very quickly changes its behavior and uses a much better teaching technique. In that case, the dodo actually gets all the assembled characters to participate in a caucus race. In theory, doing something is a really good way to understand what that thing is. In the case of the caucus race, I'm not sure anybody is any the wiser after they've done it. But I think in real life, doing something is a really good way to learn. So I've always really enjoyed doing demos. I don't actually have any demos in this talk today, but I think if you've seen me do talks before, you'll know that I do enjoy to put in a live demo. I've never been a huge fan of like hand wavy descriptions. I think diagrams with boxes and arrows, they have their place, but I really want to understand by seeing the real thing and ideally typing it in myself. So in the book, I've included a lot of examples, and I really hope that some of you will try them out. Maybe we should also try out a caucus race as well. That could also be a lot of fun. So when you try something out at your keyboard, it's a really great path to understanding things. But sometimes you can't hold everything in your head at once. Technology is really complicated, as we've acknowledged. So we break things into abstractions. This lets us build up simpler mental models. We can abstract away some of the underlying details, the underlying complexity, and build a mental model for ourselves. And sometimes those mental models might not be quite right. If you've ever done any debugging, you'll know what I mean about building a mental model of what might be happening, it's a hypothesis, and then you have to test whether or not your theory backs up reality. So you test, maybe you add some extra debugging, and you see whether or not your program behaves according to your hypothesis. And sometimes it doesn't. You have to think up a new hypothesis that fits the evidence and test again. This is, a tried and tested technique for everybody debugging. You're thinking of these mental models, these hypotheses. But do try to avoid magical thinking. The simpler explanations are more likely to be the cause, and they're probably going to be easier to test for. So if you find yourself thinking that something in your program, in your environment is appearing and disappearing like the Cheshire Cat, or changing into different kinds of creatures like they do in Alice's Adventures, it's probably time to take a break, maybe bounce some ideas off someone else and think of a simpler mental model. And thinking is really important. That kind of sounds a bit ridiculous. In security, unfortunately, we see a lot of compliance where not a lot of thinking is really going into it. Someone somewhere wrote a checklist, and people have a tendency to just want to tick off the items, comply with that checklist without necessarily thinking about the intent behind those checklist items. So I'm actually the co-author of a Kubernetes benchmark from the CIS, the Center for Internet Security. And that is a giant checklist for running Kubernetes according to security best practice. So it's not that I'm against checklists. Checklists can be really, really useful, but you do need to apply thought. If you just follow a checklist blindly, it can be really dangerous. An example of this that I'm sure many of us are familiar with is the idea of rotating user passwords. So, a long time ago, someone came up with the idea that everyone should be required to change their password every so often. The thinking is, if your password gets compromised, you don't necessarily know that an attacker has that password, but if you change it after a while, it will stop working for the attacker. This is a fantastic idea for automated passwords, but research shows that it's a terrible idea for passwords that humans have to remember. We end up writing them down, we end up using some kind of password reuse scheme to make it easy for us to remember the passwords that we're supposed to use, even though they're supposed to have changed. Those things make it easier for attackers to break the passwords and easier for them to compromise. Once they've got one password, they're able to compromise the future iterations if you're following a simple sequence. So it's actually been pretty widely recognized that password rotation for users is not a great idea. All the kind of big security authorities like NIST, the National Cybersecurity Center, SANS, they all recommend against password rotation for users. But you will still find it today on a lot of enterprise security checklists. So, like the Mad Hatter rudely interrupting Alice at the tea party, this is something that I can get a bit, upset about. I might be a bit short with people who require me to rotate my user passwords. This, unfortunately, is just scratching the surface of the kind of thoughtlessness that we sometimes see in security enforcement. And the next quote I'm going to use is not actually from Alice in Wonderland, but it has about the right level of nonsense. So this is a tweet from someone who was doing a pen test, and his client told him not to use some IP addresses that he knew he could hack into. Those IP addresses are out of scope, and the client doesn't want the pen tester to report on them, even though it puts their critical data at risk, because it's not part of the compliance checklist. So the compliance checklist has done nothing to help them actually secure the critical assets that they're trying to secure. Checklists can be great, but they need to be applied with thought. Fortunately, Alice has a more pragmatic approach to security testing. When she's presented with a bottle of liquid, she did at least read the label. This is a little bit like vulnerability scanning for your container images. She's checked whether this container is advertising the presence of a known toxin, in much the same way that an image scanner will check whether an image has known and published vulnerabilities. But I think we'd all agree this is not a terribly thorough test that Alice has performed here. She didn't check the supply chain. She has no idea where this bottle came from. She has no idea whether she can trust the label. I think we would all feel more confident if she'd got that bottle from a trusted supplier. And ideally, it would have a tamper proof lid so she would know if anything had been added into that bottle. In the world of containers, the tamper proof lid is a bit like drift prevention. You should treat your containers as immutable. You should only be running software or executables in a container that were included in the image when you built it. That way, when you scan the image, you've scanned everything that was inside the image. You don't subsequently want to add new executables that you haven't scanned. So, drift prevention is the idea of ensuring that you can't run executables that weren't in the image at the point where you scanned it. Now, if Alice wanted to be really advanced, she might have sent a sample of the liquid off to a lab to get tested. And the container equivalent of that is called dynamic threat analysis. And this is where you can take a container, run it in a secure sandbox environment, and check its behavior against known malware or bad behavior. Things like checking in case it tries to contact a cybersecurity pool. So, this is a pretty advanced way of checking that the images that you might obtain from a third party behave well and don't contain known malware. Dynamic threat analysis and drift prevention, they're a little bit more advanced. If you're doing nothing else, do make sure you're doing vulnerability scanning on your container images. Now, that's a piece of advice that I give to essentially anyone who's working in cloud native. I think vulnerability scanning it's something you can do with open source tools, and it's easy to embed into your CI/CD system. So there's really no downside. I think it's something that anyone should be doing to improve their cloud native security. But I don't think there is a simple blueprint for the whole of cloud native security that applies to everyone. I can't give you a simple route map to making your cloud native deployment secure. There are lots of different tools, lots of different processes you can apply, and some of them are only applicable in certain circumstances. And there's quite often some trade-offs to be made. For example, in performance, if you're worried about isolation between containers because you're running in a multi-tenant environment, you might want to look for a stronger isolation between your different containers. But that could potentially come with some performance trade-off. Another kind of trade-off you might see is inconvenience for your developers. You want to use security tooling that doesn't slow them down, that doesn't give them too much difficulty, so that they can continue to do their jobs and deploy software for your business. So I can't give you a simple plan for how to secure your environment. But in the book, I have tried to give, I've called it a checklist. It's a series of questions that I hope would guide you to finding and addressing the security weaknesses that might exist in your environments. More importantly, I want you to understand the consequences of different techniques that you might use. I want you to understand how containers might be compromised if you don't follow certain practices, so that you know how to apply security practices effectively in your environment. So this is the last quote from Alice that I'm going to use today, although it's actually really early in the book. She asks, what's the use of a book without pictures or conversation? I've got a few pictures in my book. They're not as fun maybe as some of the illustrations in Lewis Carroll's book, but I do have a few diagrams. I have got examples that you can try out in the Linux shell of your choice. And I'm really hoping that there will be some conversation during the day. So we do have a tea room here at Software Circus. As I mentioned before, you can go to the Aqua tea room and download the book. You can also come and say hello. Myself or members of the Aqua team will be there. I'm going to be there over lunchtime, so 12:15 Europe time. And I really hope to see you there, and I hope that there will be lots of questions.
Hello, Liz.
Hi, Mark.
I'm back again. That was wonderful.
Oh, thank you very much.
I know how strange it is to just present into a camera, imagining that people are there, uh, especially whilst wearing an unconventional costume. So well done. Let me switch
Oh,
my
thank you very much.
so we can chat. Yeah, we're seeing lots of tweets about this. I'm just trying to corral some questions from the crowd here. But I wanted to start with one of my own. So I was thinking about when you were talking about how, there are checklists and then there's behavior. And as I was scrolling through all the tweets that are coming through, I saw Kelsey had quoted Adrian at the first Software Circus conference, saying that a lot of companies were trying to copy Netflix by doing what they saw, but not the internal cultural things that they couldn't see. And they were doing fail, I think was his point. And I'm wondering, you spoke about a few behaviors of people maybe, having a checklist and sticking to it, even when common sense would say that they shouldn't do that, for example. In your experience, how much does culture have to do with effective operations in this area?
Yeah, I think that's true. And I don't think I can answer this question without slightly unfairly kind of generalizing and characterizing security teams. But there is sometimes in some organizations a culture where security folks, I guess you have to understand that, they are the bottom line for, protecting a company's data, and they're going to be on the hook if something gets compromised. So you can kind of understand why security teams traditionally will tend to be quite conservative. And I think culturally, sometimes that sort of conservatism expresses itself in these kind of rules, these checklists that get passed on from one person to the next, and eventually nobody can really remember why that rule got put in place in the first place. And yes, that can be a real frustration for people who are trying to subvert the rules, but for a good reason.
Right.
And potentially it's also frustrating for the security team as well, because they don't really know where that rule came from. So yeah, I think that's really why I'm so keen on the idea of people actually understanding what it is that they're enforcing and why.
Okay, we've got a couple more questions, but before that, I want to remind you that it's called a tea room, not a booth. Aqua have a tea room, and if you go over there, you can see Liz's book. But for the next question, and it touches on something that you just mentioned, this idea of having sort of checklists and silos and gates. Is exactly the problem that we tried to solve with DevOps, because I remember being a developer and having the same frustration, which was I just want to deploy the thing, and you're making me do all this testing that to me seems unreasonable. And I think a lot of the initial DevOps conversation was around sort of having this empathy for the operators. It's like they have concerns that you don't need to worry about. And now I'm starting to see this phrase DevSecOps. So I'm imagining that that's what's happening again. It's like, please be nice to the security people. They have concerns that aren't yours.
Absolutely. And I think in just the same way that DevOps was about automation, DevSecOps is also about automation. It's about figuring out how you can embed security checks in the pipeline, in the automated tooling, so you can have your security tooling running at all the different stages of the pipeline, the build, checking before deployment, and at runtime, ideally with as little human intervention as possible, because human intervention is what slows people down and causes frustration. But it does involve that collaboration in the first place, so that security teams are involved in setting up what those tools are enforcing, in figuring out what is the right set of checks, what are the guidelines we're going to give to developers about say, for example, what base images they're going to use. It's got
Right.
to involve the security people.
Right. So it's really a two-way street. It's not just about creating perfect tooling so developers can do what they used to do anyway. It's really both people have got to change both sides have got to change their behavior a little to get to this better flow.
Yeah, and I think we are seeing developers, and I come from a development background, so I really do understand the kind of
Me too.
the sensation of like, well, security is something that somebody else worries about. That certainly for me, many years ago, that was exactly how I thought about security. Right. But I think in the modern world, developers do understand more how important security is, and by kind of collaborate, they don't need to know every detail about security. They don't necessarily need to know everything about why, for example, I'm saying they need to, it's a helpful thing to understand what's happening in containers.
Right.
Not every developer needs to know that, but whoever's responsible for setting up the rules and the guidelines and the automation, it would be helpful for them to understand what's happening.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got a few comments coming in now. I don't know if there's a delay, but there's now a waterfall of them. A torrent. Thomas Frick says he prefers Sec DevOps. All right, Thomas, I'm all right with that. Miklos Toff asks, will the regulatory requirements like PCI ever catch up with the industry?
Oh, that's a good question. So things like PCI actually do have quite a lot of flexibility built into them. And you have to explain how, if you're not necessarily following a particular rule, why that rule doesn't apply or what you're doing instead. And I think in some organizations, that kind of challenge of, I am going to have to explain to somebody auditing my PCI environment why I'm not following the rule, that seems really hard, so I'll just follow the rule.
Right.
But over time, there's more and more sort of established, almost like case law. People have explained, why they're not following a certain guideline, and instead they've taken a different approach, and how that's worked. And this is why guidelines do evolve, over time. I think there's a case of there's a time lag before the guidelines get updated, and then there's a time lag before enterprises realize that those guidelines have been updated. The user password rotation being a really good example, where it's been years. It's like 3 years since people stopped saying that it was a good idea. I don't think anyone is saying it's a good idea anymore, but it's still a thing.
Well, that makes sense. I want to give a shout out to what's coming up next. We're going to have time for a couple more questions. I know there's lots coming in. If we don't get to you, you'll be able to find Liz through the People Finder in the Umbrella app, and I'm sure Liz will be happy to answer your questions at some point, if not immediately.
And they can come and hang out in our tea room as well.
Come and hang out in the tea room. There you go. You can get a book and you can ask Liz questions live. In a couple of minutes, Lian Lee, our other facilitator, is going to be joining me in here for the costume contest, which I love being able to say this at a software conference. This is just amazing. I feel like I'm at a village fete. Anyway, let's get one more question in, shall we? Or possibly two. Okay, is that one a good one? No, I feel like that touches the other one. Okay, where do you see Aquasec's product evolving in the future? For now, it is focused on preventative measures. Will Aquasec ever aim to be able to control state in Kubernetes, for example, with isolation capabilities?
Okay, so I think there's some interesting things. I mentioned in my talk the dynamic threat analysis, which is a new and pretty sort of revolutionary thing that we're doing in the Aqua platform. In terms of Kubernetes and state, so something that my team are working on, the open source team are working on, and we will be releasing very soon, we are looking at ways to make security more Kubernetes native. So today there are tools that kind of work alongside Kubernetes, but they tend to be separate. And I think that's true for everyone. The new project that we will be announcing very soon works to bring things more into a Kubernetes native form. So I'm going to be super excited about that in a few days or a couple of weeks.
all we have time for. I was under the impression that we would stay here for the costume contest, but that's not the case. So first of all, let's get a big virtual, you'll have to imagine them clapping, round of applause for Liz.
Thank you so much.
Well, looking at the schedule now, again, if you want to speak to Liz, go over to Aqua's tea room where you can get the book and you can speak to her more. We're going to jump over to the fun track now. You can do that by going to Borella and just clicking on the little drop down. I have to jump over to another Zoom. I'll see you there in a moment. 15 minutes after that, we're back in the main room with Justin Cormack and in the second room with Gianluca Abrazado. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.